Margaret Thompson sat in her favorite armchair, staring out the window of her small apartment. At 73 years old, her days had become predictably quiet. The morning routine never changed. Wake up at 6, make coffee, read yesterday's newspaper, and wait for the mailman to arrive with bills she could barely afford to pay. The retirement home where she lived wasn't particularly cheerful. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and loneliness. Most residents kept to themselves, shuffling past each other with polite nods but rarely stopping to chat. Margaret's children lived in different states, calling once a week out of duty rather than genuine interest. Her husband Robert had passed away 3 years ago, taking with him the laughter and warmth that once filled their home. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, something felt different. The autumn air carried an unusual chill, and Margaret pulled her worn cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She had just finished her second cup of coffee when she heard it, a soft whimpering sound coming from outside her door. Margaret paused, thinking she might have imagined it. The sound came again, more persistent this time. She slowly made her way to the front door, her arthritis making each step deliberate and careful. Through the peephole, she couldn't see anything unusual. The hallway appeared empty as always, but the whimpering continued. Against her better judgment, Margaret unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. There, sitting directly in front of her doorstep, was the most pitiful sight she had ever seen. A medium-sized dog with matted brown fur looked up at her with the saddest eyes imaginable. The animal was clearly a stray, thin, dirty, and shivering from the cold. The dog made no attempt to rush inside or jump on her. Instead, it simply sat there, tail wagging weakly as if asking permission to exist in her world. Margaret noticed the dog wore no collar, and its ribs were visible through its tangled coat. "Well, hello there," Margaret whispered, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. She hadn't spoken to another living being with such warmth in months. The dog's tail wagged a bit faster at the sound of her voice. Margaret looked down the hallway to see if anyone else was around. The retirement home had strict rules about pets, and she knew the management wouldn't appreciate a stray animal wandering the corridors. But something about this dog's presence stirred a feeling she had almost forgotten, the desire to care for something other than herself. She stepped back into her apartment and returned, with a small bowl of water, placing it just outside her door. The dog immediately began drinking, its thirst evident in the way it lapped up every drop. "You're hungry too, aren't you?" Margaret asked softly. She went to her small kitchenette and searched through her limited food supplies. Finding a can of chicken soup, she drained the broth into another bowl and carried it outside. The dog devoured the liquid gratefully, then looked up at her with what seemed like genuine appreciation. For the first time in years, Margaret felt needed. She glanced around nervously, knowing she couldn't leave the dog in the hallway much longer. Other residents would be coming and going soon, and questions would be asked. The logical thing would be to call animal control and let them handle the situation. But as Margaret looked into those trusting brown eyes, logic seemed less important than the unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. This dog had chosen her door, her hallway, her life to interrupt. Perhaps it wasn't coincidence at all. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with you," she admitted to the animal, who seemed to listen intently to every word. "I can barely take care of myself these days." The dog tilted its head slightly as if considering her dilemma. Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She opened her door wider and stepped aside. "Come on then, just for a little while until I figure this out." The dog stood up slowly and walked into her apartment with remarkable dignity, as if it had been invited into homes many times before. Once inside, it found a corner near the window and lay down quietly, making itself as small and unobtrusive as possible. Margaret closed the door behind them, her heart beating faster than it had in months. She had just broken one of the retirement home's most important rules, and she had no idea what would happen next. But for the first time since Robert's death, her apartment didn't feel quite so empty. The dog settled into its corner and closed its eyes, finally finding the safety it had been searching for. Margaret sat back down in her armchair, stealing glances at her unexpected visitor. She couldn't help but smile at the sight of the peaceful animal, already making her small space feel more like a home. Neither Margaret nor the dog could have known that this simple moment of compassion would set in motion a series of events that would transform both their lives in ways they never could have imagined. Margaret woke up the next morning to an unfamiliar sound, gentle snoring coming from the corner of her living room. For a moment she forgot about her unexpected guest, until she saw the brown furry form curled up by the window. The dog had barely moved from the spot where it first lay down, as if understanding that it needed to be invisible to stay safe. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, revealing just how rough shape the animal was really in. Its fur was more matted than she had initially realized, and she could see small cuts and scrapes along its legs. This dog had been surviving on the streets for quite some time. Margaret quietly made her way to the kitchen, trying not to wake her visitor. She put on the coffee pot and began planning her day around this new responsibility. The smart thing would be to call the local animal shelter, but something held her back. Maybe it was the way the dog had looked at her with such trust, or perhaps it was her own desperate need for companionship. As the coffee began to brew, the dog stirred and lifted its head. Their eyes met across the small apartment, and Margaret felt that same warmth from the day before. "Good morning," she whispered, feeling slightly foolish for talking to an animal. The dog's tail gave a small wag, and it stood up slowly, stretching each leg carefully. Margaret noticed it favored its left front paw, suggesting an injury that had been bothering it for some time. She opened her refrigerator and found leftover meatloaf from dinner 2 nights ago. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She placed small pieces in a bowl and set it down near the dog's corner. The animal approached cautiously but ate with obvious hunger. While the dog ate, Margaret examined it more closely. Despite its rough condition, she could see this had once been a well-cared-for pet. Its bone structure suggested good breeding, and there were traces of training in the way it waited patiently for permission before eating. "Someone loved you once, didn't they?" she said softly. "I wonder what happened to bring you to my door." The dog finished eating and sat down, looking at Margaret expectantly. She realized it probably needed to go outside, which presented her first major challenge. How could she walk a dog through the retirement home without being seen? Margaret had lived at Sunset Manor for 2 years, and she knew the morning routine of most residents. Mrs. Henderson in 2B always left for her doctor's appointments at 9 o'clock. Mr. Garcia from down the hall took his daily walk at 10:30. If she timed it right, she might be able to sneak the dog outside through the side entrance near the laundry room. She found an old rope in her closet and fashioned a makeshift leash. The dog seemed familiar with the concept and stood patiently while she tied it around its neck. "We're going to have to be very quiet," Margaret explained, feeling like a teenager sneaking past her parents. They made their way slowly down the hallway, Margaret's heart pounding with each step. The dog walked perfectly beside her, instinctively understanding the need for stealth. They reached the side exit without encountering anyone, and Margaret breathed a sigh of relief as they stepped into the morning air. Behind the building was a small garden area that most residents ignored. Margaret let the dog explore while staying alert for any sign of the building manager or maintenance staff. The animal took care of its needs quickly, then returned to her side without being called. "You're very well behaved," Margaret observed. "Someone definitely trained you properly." As they prepared to head back inside, Margaret heard footsteps approaching. She panicked, looking around for somewhere to hide, but it was too late. Dorothy Walsh, a fellow resident from the 3rd floor, rounded the corner and stopped in surprise. "Margaret Thompson, is that your dog?" Dorothy asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and concern. Margaret's mouth went dry. Dorothy was known as something of a gossip, and if she reported the dog to management, Margaret would be in serious trouble. The retirement home had a zero-tolerance policy for unauthorized pets. Well, it's complicated," Margaret stammered. But something unexpected happened. Instead of looking disapproving, Dorothy's face lit up with genuine delight. "Oh my goodness, it's beautiful," Dorothy exclaimed, kneeling down to pet the dog. "I haven't seen a dog in this place since I moved in. What's its name?" Margaret realized she hadn't even thought about the dog having a name. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "It just showed up at my door yesterday." Dorothy stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Well, we certainly can't let management know about this. They'd have that poor thing out of here faster than you could say lease violation." Margaret was stunned. She had expected judgment and threats to report her, not an offer of conspiracy. "You won't tell anyone?" Margaret asked hopefully. "Are you kidding? This is the most exciting thing that's happened here in months," Dorothy laughed. "Besides, I had to give up my cat when I moved in." I know how much you must need the company." As they walked back toward the building, Dorothy continued chattering about how lonely the place could be, and how wonderful it was that Margaret had found such a nice companion. Margaret felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years: friendship. "What are you going to call him?" Dorothy asked as they reached the side entrance. Margaret looked down at the dog, who seemed to sense they were talking about him. "I don't know yet. I hadn't really thought that far ahead." "Well, he looks like a Max to me," Dorothy suggested. "Strong and dependable." Margaret tried the name out loud. "Max?" The dog's ears perked up and his tail wagged enthusiastically. "I think he likes it," Dorothy laughed. As they parted ways in the hallway, Dorothy promising to keep their secret, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since Robert died, she had something to look forward to. She had Max, and now, unexpectedly, she had an ally in Dorothy. Walking back to her apartment with Max beside her, Margaret realized her life had already begun to change in ways she never could have anticipated. The quiet, predictable days of loneliness were behind her now. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. 3 days had passed since Max arrived, and Margaret's routine had completely transformed. Instead of sitting aimlessly in her chair, she found herself making plans around her secret companion. She woke up earlier, eager to see Max's gentle face looking back at her. She planned meals that would include something for him. Most importantly, she had a reason to venture outside her apartment beyond the basic necessities. The morning walks had become the highlight of both their days. Margaret discovered muscles she had forgotten she possessed, and her daily strolls around the small garden behind the building were lasting longer each day. Max seemed to understand the importance of staying hidden, never barking or making noise that might attract unwanted attention. Dorothy had become an unexpected ally and friend. She would often join them for their morning walks, bringing stories and laughter that Margaret had been missing for years. The two women found they had more in common than they had ever realized during their polite hallway encounters. "You look different," Dorothy observed as they watched Max sniff around the small flower beds. Happier somehow, Margaret had to agree. She felt more alive than she had since Robert's death. Having something to care for, something that depended on her, had awakened a part of herself she thought had died along with her husband, but their secret was becoming harder to maintain. Max had put on some weight with regular meals, and his coat was looking healthier after Margaret's attempts at brushing out the mats. He was becoming a beautiful, noticeable dog rather than the pitiful stray who had first appeared at her door. The real challenge came on Thursday morning when Margaret ran into Mr. Chen, the building manager, while returning from their walk. She had Max on his makeshift rope leash, and there was no way to pretend he wasn't there. "Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Chen said, his voice stern but not unkind, "you know we have policies about pets in this facility." Margaret's heart sank. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt to think about losing Max. "I know," she said quietly, "but he was abandoned, and he was so hungry and scared. I couldn't just turn him away." Mr. Chen looked down at Max, who sat perfectly still beside Margaret, sensing the tension in the conversation. The dog's calm demeanor and obvious good training were impossible to ignore. "How long has he been with you?" Mr. Chen asked. "Less than a week," Margaret admitted. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with him." To Margaret's surprise, Mr. Chen knelt down and extended his hand toward Max. The dog sniffed politely and allowed himself to be petted, his tail wagging gently. "He's well behaved," Mr. Chen observed. "Has he caused any problems? Barking, accidents, damage to your apartment?" "None at all," Margaret said quickly. "He's been perfect. Better behaved than some people, actually." Mr. Chen stood up, brushing his hands on his pants. "Mrs. Thompson, you know I should ask you to remove him immediately." Margaret nodded, feeling tears threaten to spill over. "However," Mr. Chen continued, "I also know that you've seemed different lately, brighter, and I have to admit, the pet policy exists mainly to prevent problems that this dog doesn't seem to be causing." Margaret looked up hopefully, hardly daring to breathe. "I'm going to pretend I didn't see him for now," Mr. Chen said. "But you need to make sure he stays quiet and doesn't bother other residents. And if there are any complaints or issues, he'll have to go immediately." Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Just don't make me regret this decision, Mr. Chen said with a slight smile before walking away. Margaret looked down at Max, who seemed to understand that something good had just happened. His tail wagged enthusiastically, and for the first time since he arrived, Margaret felt like she could truly relax and enjoy his company without constant worry. That evening, Dorothy came by to visit, bringing a small bag of dog treats she had purchased during her afternoon shopping trip. "I figured Max deserved something special," Dorothy explained, watching as the dog gently took a treat from her hand. "How did he end up here anyway? Have you thought about checking if anyone is looking for him?" Margaret had been avoiding that question, afraid of what she might discover. But Dorothy was right. Somewhere there might be a family missing their beloved pet. "I suppose I should put up some signs or check with the local shelters," Margaret said reluctantly. "It's the right thing to do," Dorothy agreed. "But honestly, looking at how content he seems with you, I have a feeling he's exactly where he's meant to be." That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself hoping Dorothy was right. Max had settled into his corner, but something about his posture seemed different. Instead of making himself small and invisible, he was lying more naturally, as if he finally felt secure in his new home. Margaret realized she was already thinking of her apartment as their home, rather than just hers. As she turned off the lights, she heard Max's gentle breathing from his corner, and for the first time in 3 years she fell asleep feeling completely unalone. Whatever tomorrow brought, she knew she was ready to face it with her faithful companion by her side. The thought of losing Max now seemed unbearable, but Margaret also knew she had to do the right thing. If someone was searching for this wonderful dog, she would have to find the strength to let him go. But deep in her heart, she hoped that Max's journey to her door had been permanent, not just a temporary stop on his way to somewhere else. Margaret spent the weekend creating simple found dog flyers with Dorothy's help. They used Dorothy's printer and made copies to post around the neighborhood. Each time Margaret hung up a flyer, her heart felt heavier. She was doing the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier. Max seemed to sense her anxiety. He stayed closer to her than usual, often resting his head on her knee while she sat in her chair. It was as if he understood that their time together might be limited. "Maybe no one will respond," Dorothy said hopefully as they finished hanging the last flyer outside the local grocery store. "It's been over a week now. If someone was really looking for him, wouldn't they have found him already?" Margaret wanted to believe that, but she knew it wasn't fair to Max. Somewhere there might be children crying for their lost pet, or an elderly person as lonely as she had been, wondering what happened to their faithful companion. On Monday morning, Margaret's phone rang while she was feeding Max his breakfast. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I'm calling about the flyer you posted about finding a dog." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Yes? I think you might have found my dog, Charlie. He's been missing for almost 3 weeks now. He got loose during a thunderstorm and we've been searching everywhere for him." The woman's voice was filled with hope and desperation. Margaret looked over at Max, who was watching her with those trusting brown eyes. "Can you describe him?" Margaret asked, though she already knew what the answer would be. "He's a medium-sized mixed-breed brown fur, no collar. He's about 4 years old, very well-trained and gentle. We've been heartbroken without him." Margaret closed her eyes. The description matched perfectly. "Would you like to come see him?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh yes, please. Can I come today? My daughter has been crying every night since he disappeared. We live about 20 minutes away. We think he got confused in the storm and just kept running until he was completely lost." They arranged for the woman to visit that afternoon. Margaret hung up the phone and sank into her chair, tears streaming down her face. Max immediately came over and rested his head in her lap as if trying to comfort her. "I'm sorry, boy," she whispered, stroking his soft ears. "I knew this might happen." When Dorothy arrived for their usual morning visit, she found Margaret crying quietly, while Max sat pressed against her legs. "Someone called," Margaret explained. "They think Max is their dog Charlie. They're coming to see him this afternoon." Dorothy sat down heavily in the chair across from Margaret. "Are you sure it's him? The description matches perfectly. And they said he's been missing for 3 weeks, which fits with how thin and scared he was when I found him." They spent the morning in quiet companionship, both women trying to prepare themselves for what seemed inevitable. Max seemed to sense the change in mood and stayed close to Margaret all day, rarely leaving her side even to go to his corner by the window. At 2 o'clock, there was a knock at Margaret's door. She opened it to find a woman about 40 years old standing with a young girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Sarah Martinez and this is my daughter Emma. We spoke on the phone about Charlie." Margaret stepped aside to let them in, her heart breaking as she saw the hope in the little girl's eyes. The moment Max saw them, his behavior changed completely. His tail began wagging furiously and he ran directly to Emma, who dropped to her knees and threw her arms around him. "Charlie," the little girl cried. "We missed you so much. Where have you been?" Max, Charlie, covered the child's face with kisses, his entire body wiggling with joy. There was no question that this was a reunion, not a first meeting. "Thank God," Sarah Martinez said, tears in her own eyes. "We were starting to lose hope. Charlie means everything to Emma. He's been her constant companion since we adopted him from the shelter 2 years ago." Margaret watched the joyful reunion, her own heart breaking and healing at the same time. It was clear that Max belonged with this family, that he had been deeply missed and loved. "How did he end up here?" Sarah asked. "We live clear across town." Margaret explained how Charlie had appeared at her door, thin and frightened during the storm. She described how well behaved he had been, how he had seemed to understand the need to stay quiet and hidden. "That sounds like our Charlie," Sarah said fondly. "He's always been incredibly smart and intuitive. He probably sensed that you needed him as much as he needed you." Emma looked up from where she was hugging Charlie. "Thank you for taking care of him," she said solemnly. "Mommy says you probably saved his life." Margaret knelt down to Emma's level. "He saved mine too, sweetheart. Charlie is a very special dog." As the Martinez family prepared to leave, Sarah pressed an envelope into Margaret's hand. "Please take this," she said. "It's not nearly enough to repay you for what you've done, but we want you to have it." Margaret tried to refuse, but Sarah insisted. After they left, Margaret opened the envelope to find $500 and a note that read, "Thank you for giving Charlie the love and care he needed when he was lost. We can never repay your kindness." Margaret sat in her quiet apartment feeling emptier than ever before. The silence was overwhelming after a week of having Charlie's comforting presence. But underneath the sadness, she felt something else, a sense of pride and purpose she hadn't experienced in years. She had made a difference in the world. She had saved a life, reunited a family, and shown love when it was needed most. For the first time since Robert's death, Margaret felt like her life had meaning again. Dorothy knocked on the door an hour later, bringing tea and tissues. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. "It hurts," Margaret admitted, "but it was the right thing to do." "Did you see how happy that little girl was?" Dorothy nodded. "Charlie clearly loves his family very much. You gave him the chance to find his way back to them." As they sat together drinking tea, Margaret realized something important. Letting Charlie go didn't erase the impact he had made on her life. He had awakened something in her that had been dormant for years, the capacity to love, to care, to hope again. That gift would stay with her long after Charlie was gone. The first few days after Charlie left were the hardest Margaret had experienced since Robert's funeral. The apartment felt impossibly quiet and empty. She found herself looking toward his corner by the window, expecting to see him there. Her morning routine felt hollow without the gentle sounds of his breathing and the soft patting of his paws on the floor. Dorothy checked on her daily, bringing meals and companionship, but even her friend's cheerful presence couldn't completely fill the void that Charlie had left behind. Margaret began to wonder if she had made a mistake by allowing herself to get so attached. "I should have known better," she confided to Dorothy over lunch on Thursday. "At my age, I should be smarter about protecting my heart." "Nonsense," Dorothy replied firmly. "Love is never a mistake, even when it hurts." "Especially when it hurts." That afternoon, Margaret decided to take a walk by herself for the first time since Charlie arrived. She needed fresh air, and hoped that moving around might help lift her spirits. As she made her way through the small garden behind the building, she noticed something she had never seen before: another resident sitting alone on a bench near the flower beds. The woman appeared to be about Margaret's age, with silver hair and a sad expression. Margaret recognized her as Mrs. Patterson from the first floor, though they had never spoken beyond polite nods in the elevator. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Margaret said as she approached. Mrs. Patterson looked up with surprise, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her. "Oh, yes. I suppose it is. Margaret sat down on the other end of the bench. I'm Margaret Thompson from the 3rd floor. Helen Patterson, the woman replied. I know who you are. I've seen you walking out here lately. You had a dog with you, didn't you? Margaret felt a pang at the mention of Charlie. Yes, but he went back to his real family yesterday. Turns out he was lost, not abandoned. That must have been difficult, Helen said softly. I imagine you got quite attached to him. More than I should have, Margaret admitted. I'd forgotten how much it could hurt to care about something. Helen nodded knowingly. I understand that feeling. I lost my husband 8 months ago. Some days I think it would be easier to just stop feeling anything at all. The two women sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret realized this was the first real conversation she'd had with another resident besides Dorothy. Would you like to have coffee sometime? Margaret found herself asking. I make a decent pot, and I have to admit, my apartment has been feeling pretty lonely lately. Helen's face brightened slightly. I would like that very much. As they walked back to the building together, Margaret felt a small spark of the same warmth she had experienced when she first met Charlie. It wasn't the same kind of love, but it was connection, and that was something she desperately needed. That evening, Margaret's phone rang. She was surprised to hear Sarah Martinez's voice on the other end. Mrs. Thompson, I hope you don't mind me calling. Emma insisted I check on you. She's been worried that you might be sad without Charlie. Margaret was touched by the child's thoughtfulness. That's very sweet of her. I am missing him, but I'm glad he's home where he belongs. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling, Sarah continued. Emma has been talking nonstop about how much Charlie seemed to love you. She has an idea, and I wanted to run it past you. Margaret waited, curious about what the little girl might have suggested. Emma thinks you should get your own dog. She says Charlie told her, and yes, she insists they have conversations, that you need a companion just like he needed a family. Margaret smiled despite her sadness. She sounds like a very wise little girl. She is. And here's the thing. I volunteer at the animal shelter where we originally adopted Charlie. There are so many dogs there who need homes, especially older dogs, that people tend to overlook. If you're interested, I'd be happy to help you find the right match. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She hadn't considered the possibility of adopting a dog of her own. At her age, with her limited income and the retirement home's restrictions, it had seemed impossible. I don't know if the building management would allow it, Margaret said hesitantly. Actually, I spoke with Mr. Chen this afternoon, Sarah said. I wanted to thank him for being so understanding about Charlie, and I mentioned Emma's idea. He said that as long as the dog was well behaved and properly registered as an emotional support animal, he would be willing to work with you. Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. He said that? He did. Apparently Charlie made quite an impression on him. He said any dog that could be as well-mannered as Charlie would be welcome at Sunset Manor. After they hung up, Margaret sat in her chair, her mind racing with possibilities. The idea of having a dog of her own, a permanent companion who wouldn't have to leave, was both exciting and terrifying. She thought about Charlie and how much joy he had brought to her life in just 1 week. She thought about Helen Patterson sitting alone in the garden, and Dorothy, who had become such a dear friend through their shared secret. She thought about the money Sarah had given her, which was certainly enough to cover adoption fees and initial supplies. Most importantly, she thought about how it had felt to have a purpose again, to wake up each morning with someone depending on her care and love. Margaret picked up the phone and called Dorothy. How would you feel about helping me pick out a dog? She asked when her friend answered. Dorothy's delighted laughter filled the quiet apartment with warmth. I thought you'd never ask. When do we start looking? Tomorrow, Margaret said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. If I'm going to do this, there's no point in waiting. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation for the future. Charlie had opened her heart again, and now she was ready to share that love with another dog who needed a home just as much as she needed a companion. The apartment still felt empty without Charlie, but it no longer felt hopeless. Tomorrow she would begin a new chapter, one that would be entirely her own choice and her own adventure. Margaret stood outside the Riverside Animal Shelter on Saturday morning, feeling nervous and excited in equal measure. Dorothy had insisted on coming along for moral support. and Sarah Martinez had met them there with Emma, who was practically bouncing with enthusiasm. "Remember," Sarah said as they walked toward the entrance, "we're looking for a dog that matches your lifestyle. Probably an older, calmer dog who would be happy with gentle walks and lots of quiet companionship." The shelter was louder and more overwhelming than Margaret had expected. Dogs of all sizes and ages barked from their kennels, each hoping to catch the attention of potential adopters. Margaret felt a bit dizzy from all the noise and activity. "Let's start with the senior dogs," Sarah suggested, leading them toward a quieter section of the shelter. "They're often the hardest to place, but they make wonderful companions." In the third kennel they visited, Margaret saw her. A golden retriever mix, probably about 8 years old, lay quietly in the back corner of her enclosure. Unlike the other dogs, she wasn't barking or jumping at the fence. Instead, she simply looked up at Margaret with gentle, intelligent eyes. "What's her story?" Margaret asked the volunteer who was showing them around. "That's Bella," the young woman explained. "She was surrendered last month when her elderly owner passed away. The family couldn't keep her, so here she is. She's been pretty depressed since she arrived. She's not used to all the noise and chaos." Margaret knelt down in front of the kennel. Bella slowly got up and walked over to the fence, pressing her nose against the metal bars. Margaret extended her fingers and Bella gently licked them. "She reminds me of you," Dorothy whispered. Dignified and a little sad, but still hopeful. "Can I meet her properly?" Margaret asked. They moved to a small visitation room where Bella was brought in on a leash. The moment they were alone together, the dog's entire demeanor changed. She walked directly to Margaret and rested her head on her lap, sighing contentedly as Margaret stroked her soft fur. "I think she's chosen you," Emma said with the wisdom that only children possess. Margaret looked into Bella's amber eyes and saw something familiar, the same loneliness and need for companionship that she had been carrying for years. But she also saw something else: resilience and the capacity to love again despite loss. "She's been waiting for you," Sarah observed, "just like Charlie was waiting for us to find him." The adoption process took most of the afternoon, but Margaret didn't mind. She used the money Sarah had given her to cover Bella's adoption fees, vaccinations, and initial supplies. Mr. Chen had even provided the necessary documentation for Bella to be registered as Margaret's emotional support animal. When they finally arrived back at Sunset Manor, Bella walked calmly beside Margaret through the front entrance. Several residents stopped to admire the beautiful dog, and Margaret felt a surge of pride introducing her new companion. "She's lovely," said Mrs. Henderson from 2B. "What's her name?" "Bella," Margaret replied, enjoying the way the name sounded when she said it. "She's going to be living with me." Mr. Chen appeared in the lobby and approached them with a smile. "So this is the new resident I've heard about. She's certainly well behaved?" Bella sat politely beside Margaret, her tail wagging gently as she allowed Mr. Chen to pet her. It was clear that she had been well trained and socialized. "I think she's going to fit in perfectly here," Mr. Chen said. "Welcome to Sunset Manor, Bella." When they reached Margaret's apartment, Bella explored each room slowly and thoroughly, her nose working to understand her new environment. Finally, she settled in the same corner by the window where Charlie had made himself comfortable. But somehow she made the space entirely her own. That first evening, as Margaret prepared dinner, she realized how different this felt from Charlie's arrival. With Charlie, there had been uncertainty and secrecy. With Bella, there was only joy and anticipation for the future they would build together. Dorothy joined them for dinner, bringing a welcome gift of dog toys and treats. "Look how content she is," Dorothy observed as Bella lay peacefully beside Margaret's chair. "It's like she's been living here for years." Over the following weeks, Margaret's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Bella proved to be everything she had hoped for in a companion. The dog was calm and gentle, happy to spend quiet mornings sitting by the window or accompanying Margaret on increasingly longer walks around the neighborhood. But Bella's impact went far beyond companionship. Other residents began stopping by to visit with the friendly dog, and Margaret found herself hosting impromptu coffee gatherings in her apartment. Helen Patterson became a regular visitor, and several other lonely residents began joining their informal group. "You've created a little community center here." Dorothy laughed one afternoon as 6 residents crowded into Margaret's small living room. All of them focused on Bella, who basked in the attention. Margaret realized Dorothy was right. Bella had given her something even more valuable than companionship. She had given her a way to connect with others, to feel useful and needed by her community. 3 months after Bella's arrival, Margaret received an unexpected phone call. It was Emma Martinez, Charlie's little girl. "Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to tell you something," Emma said in her serious 8-year-old voice. "Charlie told me that he's really happy you found Bella. He says he always knew you needed a dog of your own." Margaret smiled, touched by the child's imagination and kindness. "Please tell Charlie I said hello and that I'm taking very good care of Bella." "I will." "And Mrs. Thompson? Charlie also says thank you for teaching him that sometimes getting lost is really just finding your way to where you're supposed to be." After hanging up, Margaret looked down at Bella, who was lying contentedly at her feet. She thought about Charlie's words as relayed by a wise little girl. Perhaps that was exactly what had happened to all of them. They had gotten lost only to find their way to exactly where they belonged. Margaret was no longer the isolated, lonely woman who had opened her door to a frightened stray dog 6 months earlier. She was someone with purpose, connections, and hope for the future. Her apartment had become a gathering place for other residents seeking companionship. Her days were filled with walks, visits, and the simple joy of caring for Bella. Most importantly, she had learned that love, whether for a person or an animal, was never wasted, even when it involved loss. Charlie had taught her that she still had room in her heart for caring, and Bella had shown her that it was never too late to build a new life filled with meaning and connection. As Margaret settled into her chair that evening with Bella curled up beside her, she reflected on how a single moment of compassion had changed everything. Opening her door to Charlie had opened her heart to possibilities she thought were gone forever. The apartment was no longer quiet and empty. It was filled with the gentle sounds of Bella's breathing, the occasional visit from neighbors, and most importantly, the warmth of knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for love, friendship, and purpose. Margaret Thompson had found her way home, and she was no longer alone.